Welcome to Miss Scarlett. Subscribe and don't miss out on Patreon. Have fun! Under the radiant night sky, after-work drinks heated the evening with provocative banter. The marketing team, in a spirited debate about their upcoming gender-focused campaign, unwittingly sparked a rebellious dare among themselves. Amidst the spirited exchange, Tom, his eyes sparkling with mischief, nudged his comrade Nolan with a playful jab. "Nolan, with opinions like yours, we'd guess you believe women have it better." Laughter and chatter paused, creating a spotlight on Nolan. Feeling the liquors lift, he smiled, momentarily forgetting his nerves. "Honestly, when was the last time you offered your male colleague a drink or opened the door for him? Women enjoy these courtesies." "Comfortable. Try wearing heels for 8 hours, or having strange men follow you to your car." "Not to mention being talked over in meetings," Melissa added. "Or having your ideas attributed to the guy who repeats them," chimed in Diana. Nolan had raised his hands defensively. Okay. I just think some things are easier, that's all." That's when Tom had proposed the challenge, with a mischievous glint in his eye. "Put your money where your mouth is, Nolan. Spend a weekend living as a woman. The whole experience. Clothes, makeup, going out in public. Then tell us how easy it is." The table had erupted in cheers and laughter. Nolan, never one to back down from a challenge and slightly offended by their dismissal of his perspective, had agreed. "Fine, 1 weekend. But when I prove my point, you're all buying my drinks for a month." That had been Wednesday night. Now it was Friday afternoon, and Nolan stood in his apartment surrounded by shopping bags, regretting every life choice that had led to this moment. He pulled out his phone and opened the browser, typing "makeup tutorial for beginners." 3 hours of YouTube videos later, his bathroom counter looked like a Sephora had exploded on it. Foundation, concealer, blush, mascara, eyeliner. He'd bought it all, following the recommendations of beauty influencers who made it look effortless. It was not effortless. "How do they do this every day?" he muttered, trying for the 3rd time to apply eyeliner without stabbing himself in the eye. The foundation felt heavy on his skin, and he'd already washed his face twice after botched attempts. Finally, he achieved something that looked passable, not professional by any means, but enough that he wouldn't immediately stand out as someone who had no idea what they were doing. The brunette wig came next, carefully positioned to hide his short brown hair underneath. Then came the clothes. He'd shopped online and picked up everything yesterday, choosing items that seemed like they would fit his frame. The flowing pink sundress was loose enough to disguise his masculine physique, though he'd also purchased some shaping undergarments that the sales associate had recommended when he'd claimed he was shopping for his sister. Dana, he reminded himself, slipped into the dress, surprised by how light the fabric felt against his skin. The white kitten heels were next, modest by most standards, but already uncomfortable after standing in them for just a few minutes. He turned to face the mirror and nearly gasped. The stranger looking back at him was convincingly feminine. Not a runway model by any means, but a regular woman you might pass on the street without a second glance. The sundress complemented his newly feminine appearance, and the wig's brown waves softened his features.
"Hello, Dana,"
he said softly, testing a higher pitch to his voice. It sounded forced to his ears, but it would have to do. He practiced a few more phrases, finding a tone that seemed natural enough without straining his vocal cords. The plan was to start small, a trip to the mall, perhaps dinner at a casual restaurant. Just enough public interaction to satisfy the terms of the bet without unnecessarily challenging himself. He grabbed a small purse, another new purchase, and transferred his wallet, keys, and phone. The first challenge came immediately, leaving his apartment building. Normally, he would bound down the stairs 2 at a time, but the kitten heels made that impossible. He took careful, measured steps, gripping the railing. In the lobby, his neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, smiled at him.
"Good evening, dear. Don't think we've met. Are you visiting someone?"
Nolan froze for a moment before remembering his voice practice.
"Yes, just for the weekend. I'm Dana." "Well, enjoy your stay, Dana. It's supposed to be beautiful weather."
Nolan nodded, heart pounding as he realized he'd passed his first test. If Mrs. Henderson, who had lived across the hall from him for 3 years, didn't recognize him, maybe this disguise was better than he thought. Outside, he immediately became conscious of how different walking felt. The heels changed his posture, forcing him to take smaller steps. The dress swished around his legs with each movement, a constant reminder of his transformation. He'd decided to take public transportation rather than his car, all part of the full experience. At the bus stop, he shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of how the bench offered no privacy in a dress. He crossed his legs like he'd seen women do, then uncrossed them when it felt unnatural, then crossed them again when he caught a man looking at him. The bus arrived, and Nolan stepped aboard, fumbling with his transit card while trying to maintain his balance in the unfamiliar shoes. He found a seat near the middle and settled in, placing his purse on his lap. 2 stops later, a group of young men boarded, loud and slightly rowdy. They took seats nearby, and Nolan felt a prickle of awareness as one of them looked in his direction, then nudged his friend. The friend turned and gave Nolan a deliberate once-over before smiling in a way that made him deeply uncomfortable.
"Hey, pretty lady, where you headed tonight?"
The man called across the aisle. Nolan stared straight ahead, unsure how to respond. Was this normal? Did women deal with this regularly?
"I'm talking to you, sweetheart. Pink dress. What's your name?"
The attention made Nolan's skin crawl. He considered responding rudely, but remembered he was supposed to be experiencing life as a woman, not as himself in a dress. What would a woman do in this situation?
"I'm just heading home,"
he said quietly, using his practiced voice.
"Let me keep you company,"
the man persisted.
"Get your number?" "No, thank you,"
Nolan replied, heart racing. The man's friend laughed.
"Playing hard to get, huh?"
Nolan was saved by the bus arriving at his stop. He stood carefully and moved toward the exit, uncomfortably aware of the men watching him. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, he heard one of them call out, "You're lost, babe!" He exhaled heavily once the bus pulled away. The entire interaction had lasted less than 2 minutes, but it had left him feeling exposed and vulnerable in a way he'd never experienced before. And he hadn't even reached the mall yet. The shopping center was crowded with Friday evening shoppers. Nolan moved cautiously through the throngs of people, constantly aware of his appearance and how others might perceive him. He noticed immediately how people tended to brush past him, sometimes bumping into his shoulder without apology, something that rarely happened when he moved through crowds as himself. His first destination was a department store. He had decided to continue the experiment by shopping for women's clothing, something that would have drawn strange looks if he'd done it as himself. Now, as Dana, he could browse freely. As he fingered the fabric of a blue blouse, a saleswoman approached with a friendly smile. "Can I help you find anything today?"
"Just browsing,"
Nolan replied, then added,
"Actually, do you have this in a medium?"
The interaction was so normal, so unremarkable, that Nolan felt a small thrill. He was doing it, passing as a woman in ordinary, everyday situations. The saleswoman brought him the blouse and even suggested a skirt that would match. Nolan found himself enjoying the experience more than he'd expected, appreciating the textures and colors available in women's fashion that were absent from his usual wardrobe. He even tried on the outfit in the fitting room, another first. The curtained space felt intimate and foreign simultaneously. The blouse fit well over his padded bra, and the skirt hung nicely thanks to the shaping garments. He bought both items, feeling strangely pleased with his selections. By 6 o'clock, Nolan's feet were killing him. The kitten heels, modest as they were, created pressure points he'd never experienced before. He found a bench and sat down, flexing his toes in relief. "First time in heels?" Nolan looked up to see a woman in her 30s, smiling knowingly at him. For a terrible moment, he thought he'd been discovered, but her expression held no suspicion.
"Is it that obvious?"
he asked. "Only to someone who's been there. Try moleskin on the pressure points, and never wear new shoes for an all-day outing." She gestured to her own sensible flats. "I learned that lesson the hard way." "Thanks for the tip," Nolan said, genuinely grateful. "No problem. We girls have to look out for each other." With a friendly wave, she continued on her way. The casual solidarity struck Nolan deeply. There was something in that brief interaction, a shared understanding, an acknowledgement of common experience, that felt completely different from his normal male interactions. Dinner was his next challenge. He'd chosen a mid-range restaurant in the mall, thinking it would be easier than a standalone place. The hostess led him to a small table, and Nolan immediately noticed the different treatment. The server was more attentive, his tone gentler than what Nolan was accustomed to.
"Can I get you something to drink while you decide?" "Just water, please,"
Nolan replied, studying the menu. When the waiter returned with his water, Nolan ordered a salad and pasta, suddenly self-conscious about eating a large meal in public. Was that something women worried about? He wasn't sure, but he found himself cutting smaller bites and eating more delicately than usual. Halfway through his meal, he noticed a man at the bar watching him. When their eyes met, the man raised his glass slightly in acknowledgement. Nolan quickly looked away, focusing intently on his pasta. A few minutes later, the server approached with a glass of white wine.
"Compliments of the gentleman at the bar,"
he said, placing it before Nolan. Nolan felt a flush of panic. This wasn't something he'd prepared for. He looked up to see the man smiling expectantly. What was the protocol here? Accept graciously? Decline? Send it back?
"Thank you, but I don't drink white wine,"
he told the server in a low voice.
"Could you thank him, but take it back?"
The server nodded understandingly and removed the glass. Nolan watched from the corner of his eye as the man received the news with a shrug, then turned his attention elsewhere. The relief Nolan felt was surprising in its intensity. When the check came, Nolan noticed the server had automatically placed it to the side of the table rather than directly in front of him, as would typically happen when he dined as himself. These small differences accumulated throughout the evening, building a picture of subtle but persistent gender expectations. By the time he returned to his apartment, Nolan's feet were blistered, his back ached from maintaining unfamiliar posture, and he had a newfound appreciation for the constant vigilance women maintained in public spaces. He'd been aware of every person who approached too closely, every lingering glance, every potential threat in a way he'd never experienced before. He kicked off the kitten heels with a groan of relief and went straight to the bathroom to remove the makeup. The process took longer than he expected, requiring multiple applications of the makeup remover he'd purchased. As the last traces of foundation washed away, he stared at his familiar face in the mirror, trying to reconcile the day's experiences with his previous perceptions. But this was only Friday night. The challenge was for the entire weekend, and he had promised his coworkers photographic evidence of his activities. There was still Saturday and Sunday to go. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear. Nolan allowed himself to sleep in, postponing the transformation process for as long as possible. Finally, around 10, he dragged himself out of bed and began the now familiar routine of becoming Dana. The makeup went more smoothly this time, his hands steadier as he applied foundation and blush. He chose a different outfit, white jeans and a floral top, and opted for flat sandals instead of heels. His poor feet deserved a break. Today's agenda included a trip to the grocery store, lunch at an outdoor cafe, and perhaps a walk in the park. Normal weekend activities, but experienced through a different lens. The grocery store proved unexpectedly challenging. Nolan was accustomed to moving quickly through the aisles, grabbing items efficiently without much thought. As Dana, he found himself receiving unsolicited advice from a male shopper about which brand of coffee was superior. When reaching for items on higher shelves, he noticed how the floral top rode up, exposing his midriff, and quickly tugged it down, feeling oddly vulnerable. At the checkout, the clerk barely made eye contact, speaking in a disinterested monotone. Nolan wondered if this was typical, or if the man was just having a bad day. Then he watched as the same clerk animated considerably for the older male customer behind him, discussing a recent sports game with enthusiasm. These subtle differences continued at the cafe. Seated alone with his sandwich and iced tea, Nolan noticed how the waitstaff checked on him less frequently than nearby tables with male patrons. When he did manage to flag down the server for a refill, the interaction was briefer, more perfunctory. The park was a mixed experience. The sunshine and gentle breeze felt wonderful against his skin, and the flowing top allowed for more airflow than his usual weekend t-shirts. But the freedom came with an unexpected price, the constant awareness of being observed. A group of runners passed by, and Nolan caught one turning back for a second look. An older man on a bench smiled too widely as he walked past. A teenager on a skateboard whistled, the sound cutting through the peaceful park atmosphere like a knife. None of these interactions were overtly threatening, but their cumulative effect was exhausting. By mid-afternoon, Nolan found himself unconsciously scanning his surroundings, assessing potential exits, keeping his keys clutched in his hand when walking to his car, behaviors he'd never considered necessary before. He had planned to visit a bookstore next, but the constant vigilance had drained him. Instead, he headed home, looking forward to the sanctuary of his apartment. As he approached his building, he saw his neighbor David washing his car in the parking lot. David waved casually, then did a double take, clearly not recognizing Dana. His expression shifted to something Nolan had never seen directed at him before, a sort of speculative interest. "Hey there," David called. "You visiting someone in the building?" "Yes," Nolan replied, keeping his voice light. "Just for the weekend." "Well, if you need someone to show you around the neighborhood, I'd be happy to volunteer." David's tone was friendly, but underlaid with something else. Something that made Nolan acutely aware of his vulnerability. "Thanks, but I'm pretty busy," he replied, quickening his pace toward the entrance. "Maybe next time," David called after him. Inside the safety of his apartment, Nolan sat heavily on the couch, not even bothering to remove his wig or makeup. He'd known David for 2 years. They had occasionally grabbed beers together, complained about the building's management, even helped each other move furniture. Yet the way David had looked at Dana was completely different from how he looked at Nolan. That night, Even after removing the disguise and returning to his male appearance, Nolan had trouble sleeping. His mind kept replaying the various interactions of the past 2 days, comparing them to his normal experiences. The constant awareness, the subtle dismissals, the unwanted attention, all of it swirled in his consciousness, reshaping his understanding. Sunday morning arrived with a strange feeling of anticipation. Part of Nolan wanted to abandon the challenge. He'd proven his point, hadn't he? But another part, a part he wasn't entirely comfortable acknowledging, was curious about spending one more day as Dana. He chose the pink sundress again, liking how it moved around his legs. The makeup application went smoothly now, almost meditative in its precise steps. The wig's brown waves settled perfectly around his face. He even added earrings this time, simple studs that clipped on without requiring pierced ears. Today's plan included brunch at a popular neighborhood spot and an afternoon at the art museum, activities that would allow him to be in public spaces while still providing some measure of comfort and safety. Brunch was busy, the restaurant filled with weekend crowds. The hostess led Nolan to a small table near the back, and he couldn't help but notice she seated the single male diner who arrived after him at a more prominent table by the window. A small thing, perhaps meaningless, but it registered nonetheless. The food was delicious, but Nolan found himself calculating the bill carefully, aware that as a woman, the server might assume he would tip less. He left an extra generous amount, wondering how many such adjustments women made to counter assumptions. The art museum was a revelation. Moving through the quiet galleries as Dana, Nolan noticed how differently he experienced the space. Security guards tracked his movements more closely than he was accustomed to. Other visitors stood slightly too close when looking at the same exhibits. A tour guide addressed her explanations to the men in the group, even when Nolan had asked the question. Yet there were pleasant discoveries, too. A female docent struck up a conversation about brushwork techniques, engaging him in a discussion more detailed and technical than any Nolan had experienced in previous visits. 2 older women invited him to join them in admiring a particularly striking sculpture, offering perspectives he might never have considered. By late afternoon, Nolan was both exhausted and strangely invigorated. The weekend had been challenging, often uncomfortable, but also illuminating in ways he hadn't anticipated. He'd expected to confirm his beliefs about the relative ease of women's experiences. Instead, he'd discovered an entirely different reality, one filled with constant calculations and adjustments he'd never had to make. As he entered his apartment for the final time as Dana, he felt a peculiar reluctance. There had been something freeing about the flowing clothes, the different way of moving through the world. Despite the challenges, or perhaps because of them, he had accessed parts of himself normally kept carefully controlled. He took one last photo as Dana, smiling softly at the camera, evidence for his coworkers that he had completed the challenge. Then he removed the earrings, the wig, the makeup, returning to his usual appearance. But something had shifted. As he hung the pink sundress and floral top in his closet rather than discarding them, Nolan acknowledged that this weekend had changed him in ways he couldn't yet fully articulate. Monday morning arrived with its usual alarm and routine. Nolan dressed in his standard work attire: charcoal slacks, blue button-down, polished shoes. The familiar clothes felt simultaneously comfortable and constraining after a weekend in flowing fabrics. He arrived at the office to find his coworkers gathered around Tom's desk, clearly awaiting his arrival. Their expressions ranged from amused to curious. "Well?" Tom prompted, as Nolan set down his laptop bag. "How was your weekend as a woman?" ready to admit you were wrong. Nolan paused, considering his response carefully.
I was wrong, he said finally, but not in the way you might think.
He pulled out his phone and showed them the photos. Dana at the mall, at the cafe, at the museum. Their reactions shifted from amusement to surprise as they realized how thoroughly he had committed to the challenge. I discovered that what I thought was having it easy is actually navigating a completely different set of rules and expectations. Nolan continued. The free drinks come with strings attached. The comfortable clothes come with constant awareness of how others might perceive you. The help offered isn't always welcome or necessary. Rebecca nodded approvingly. So, you get it now? I'm starting to, Nolan replied honestly. I don't think I can ever fully understand, but yeah, I have a different perspective now.
Well, you certainly look nice in pink,
Tom joked, lightening the moment. They all laughed, and the conversation shifted to weekend stories and upcoming projects. But throughout the day, Nolan noticed small things he'd previously overlooked. How Melissa was interrupted 3 times during the morning meeting, how Diana's suggestion was dismissed until Richard rephrased it minutes later, how Rebecca tensed subtly when a male client stood too close to her desk. These observations continued in the following days. Nolan found himself speaking up when he noticed these patterns, advocating for his female colleagues in ways that earned him surprised but appreciative glances. 2 weeks after the challenge, Nolan was sorting through his closet when he paused at the pink sundress. He had intended to donate the weekend's purchases, but something stopped him. The memory of how free he had felt in those flowing fabrics, how the different clothes had allowed him to access different aspects of himself, lingered. On impulse, he slipped the dress off its hanger and held it against himself, looking in the mirror. Without the wig and makeup, he was clearly himself, Nolan, but there was something in his expression that reminded him of Dana. A softness, perhaps, a different way of seeing. He carefully rehung the dress. Maybe he would keep it after all. Not for another public challenge, but as a private reminder of perspectives gained and assumptions lost. The marketing campaign they ultimately created was one of the company's most successful, resonating with audiences across demographics. Nolan's contributions, informed by his weekend experiences, brought a nuance to the messaging that might otherwise have been missing. And if, occasionally, in the privacy of his apartment, Nolan revisited aspects of Dana's wardrobe, appreciating the feel of fabric draping differently, the freedom of movement, the expression of parts of himself usually kept hidden, that was his own journey of understanding, ongoing and evolving. The weekend challenge had started as a dare, a joke among coworkers. It had become something far more significant, a window into experiences different from his own, a catalyst for change in his thinking and actions. We girls have to look out for each other, the woman in the mall had said. Nolan wasn't a woman, and never would be, but he had glimpsed a reality previously invisible to him. That glimpse had transformed him in subtle but permanent ways, changing not just how he saw others, but how he understood himself. As time passed, Nolan's perspective continued to evolve. The weekend, as Dana had been just the beginning, a first step toward greater empathy and awareness. The journey continued, one conversation, one observation, one realization at a time. And whenever colleagues or friends made dismissive comments about gender experiences, Nolan would smile slightly and say, "You know, I used to think that too, but I've learned there's always more to understand." The pink sundress remained in his closet, not as a costume, but as a reminder of challenges faced, assumptions challenged, and perspectives forever changed. Thanks for watching my girlies. Be sure to check out Patreon for more.